Ancient Egypt is usually reduced to three things: pyramids, mummies, and pharaohs in golden masks. But those images actually come from wildly different centuries of a civilization that lasts an almost unbelievable 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, more time separates the construction of the Great Pyramid from Cleopatra than separates Cleopatra from us. Egypt isn't one static kingdom frozen in time. It rises, collapses, rebuilds, gets invaded, absorbs its invaders, and reinvents itself again and again for 3 millennia. This is the entire history of ancient Egypt. None of it happens without the Nile. Egypt sits in one of the driest regions on Earth, but every year the river floods with almost clockwork reliability, depositing a fresh layer of fertile black silt across the surrounding land. This single predictable event turns a narrow ribbon of desert into some of the richest farmland in the ancient world, and it shapes Egyptian civilization from the very beginning. Early farming communities cluster along the river as far back as 5000 BC, and over time, two distinct cultural zones emerge: Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile flows through a narrow valley, and Lower Egypt in the north, where the river fans out into the marshy Nile delta. Around 3100 BC, tradition holds that a king named Narmer, possibly the same figure remembered in later sources as Menes, conquers Lower Egypt and unites both regions under a single crown. The Narmer Palette, an ornately carved slab discovered by archaeologists, shows this king wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt, one of the earliest pieces of political propaganda in human history. This unification marks the beginning of the early dynastic period, and with it, the invention of a system that will define Egypt for the next 3,000 years, the pharaoh as a divine king, considered a living god on earth, and the essential link between the gods and the Egyptian people. A new capital, Memphis, is founded near the point where Upper and Lower Egypt meet, a deliberate symbol of the newly unified kingdom. By around 2686 BC, Egypt enters what's remembered as the Old Kingdom, and this is when the country begins building on a scale nobody had ever attempted before. The pharaoh Djoser commissions his architect, a brilliant official named Imhotep, to build something entirely new, a massive step structure at Saqqara that becomes the first step pyramid, and quite possibly the oldest large-scale stone building on Earth. It's such a success that Imhotep is later worshipped as a god of wisdom and medicine in his own right, one of the few non-royal Egyptians ever granted that honor. The pharaoh Sneferu takes pyramid building even further, experimenting with increasingly ambitious designs. His first attempt develops a dangerous crack partway through construction and has to be finished with a strange change in angle partway up, earning it the modern nickname the Bent Pyramid. But Sneferu doesn't give up, and his next attempt, the Red Pyramid, becomes the first successful, true, smooth-sided pyramid in Egyptian history. His son, Khufu, then builds the most ambitious structure of them all, the Great Pyramid of Giza, using an estimated 2 million blocks of stone and standing as the tallest man-made structure on the planet for almost 4,000 years afterward. Khufu's son and grandson, Khafre and Menkaure, build their own pyramids alongside his at Giza, and Khafre also commissions the Great Sphinx, a massive limestone guardian carved with the body of a lion, and most likely his own face. This is the peak of Old Kingdom power, a highly centralized state where the pharaoh commands enormous resources and a skilled, well-organized workforce, not slaves as popular myth often claims, but paid laborers, farmers fulfilling a kind of seasonal tax obligation during the months when the Nile floods make farming impossible anyway. But that centralized power doesn't last forever. Over the following centuries, provincial governors called nomarchs grow increasingly independent and powerful, drawing authority away from the pharaoh's court. Around 2181 BC, a severe and prolonged drought disrupts the Nile's flooding pattern for decades, crippling agriculture and central authority at the same time. The result is the First Intermediate Period, a roughly 150-year stretch of fragmented rule, competing regional dynasties, and genuine chaos, a sharp reminder that even Egypt's most impressive achievements rest entirely on the reliability of a single river. Egypt eventually pulls itself back together. Around 2055 BC, a Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II reunifies the country by force, launching the Middle Kingdom, often remembered as Egypt's classical age of literature, art, and administration. Middle Kingdom pharaohs expand Egyptian control south into Nubia, securing access to gold and valuable trade goods, and undertake major irrigation projects around the Fayum region to reclaim new farmland from the desert. It's a genuine golden age, but once again, prosperity doesn't last uninterrupted. Toward the end of the Middle Kingdom, a group known as the Hyksos, likely originating from the Levant, gradually settle in the Nile Delta, and eventually seize control of Lower Egypt entirely, ruling as a foreign dynasty from the city of Avaris. The Hyksos bring genuinely useful new technology with them, most notably the horse-drawn chariot and improved bronze weaponry, tools the Egyptians themselves will soon adopt and perfect. This period of foreign rule and internal division is remembered as the Second Intermediate Period, and to many Egyptians it's a national humiliation. But it also plants the seed for the most powerful phase of Egyptian history yet to come. Around 1550 BC, a Theban pharaoh named Ahmose I finally drives the Hyksos out of Egypt entirely, reunifying the country and launching the New Kingdom, the era when Egypt transforms from a wealthy river kingdom into a genuine empire. Egyptian armies, now equipped with the same chariots and bronze weapons the Hyksos had introduced, push north into the Levant and south deep into Nubia. The pharaoh Thutmose III leads roughly 17 military campaigns into the Near East, earning him the nickname the Napoleon of Egypt among modern historians, and extending Egyptian influence further than at any point before or since. One of the New Kingdom's most fascinating rulers isn't primarily a conqueror at all. Hatshepsut, one of the very few women ever to rule Egypt as pharaoh in her own right, rather than as a queen consort, presides over roughly 2 decades of peace and prosperity, commissioning a famous trading expedition to the distant land of Punt, and an enormous mortuary temple at Deir al-Bahari that still stands today. After her death, later inscriptions of her name and image are deliberately chiseled away, likely an attempt by her successor to erase an uncomfortable precedent of female rule from the official record. But the most disruptive New Kingdom pharaoh by far is Akhenaten. Around 1353 BC, Akhenaten abandons Egypt's entire traditional religious system, built around a vast pantheon of gods managed by an enormously wealthy priesthood, and instead promotes worship of a single solar deity, the Aten. He builds an entirely new capital city, Amarna, dedicated to this new faith, and this radical religious revolution, often described as history's earliest known experiment with monotheism, upends Egyptian society and infuriates the traditional priesthood. It doesn't survive him. After Akhenaten's death, his young successor, a boy king remembered as Tutankhamun, reverses the religious reforms and restores the old gods, and Amarna is largely abandoned. Tutankhamun himself dies young and would likely be a footnote in history, if not for the sheer luck that his nearly untouched tomb survives intact into the modern era, making him, ironically, the most famous pharaoh in the world, despite ruling for less than a decade. Egypt's greatest builder and one of its longest reigning monarchs comes soon after. Ramesses II, remembered by later generations as Ramesses the Great, rules for an astonishing 66 years, constructing more monuments than any pharaoh before or since, including the massive rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel. Early in his reign, he leads Egyptian forces against the rival Hittite Empire at the Battle of Kadesh, a massive and inconclusive clash of empires that Ramesses nonetheless has carved onto temple walls across Egypt as a glorious personal victory. The real resolution comes years later in 1259 BC, when Egypt and the Hittites sign a formal peace treaty, the oldest surviving international peace agreement in world history, a copy of which today hangs, fittingly, at the headquarters of the United Nations. But even Ramesses' long, prosperous reign can't hold back a wave of instability sweeping across the entire eastern Mediterranean. In the early 12th century BC, a mysterious coalition of raiders known as the Sea Peoples devastates civilizations across the region, toppling the Hittite Empire entirely and severely weakening nearly everyone else. Ramesses III manages to fight off major Sea Peoples invasions of Egypt itself, in what's remembered as one of the first large-scale naval battles in recorded history, but the cost is enormous, and the wider Bronze Age trade networks Egypt had relied on for centuries collapse anyway. The New Kingdom limps on for a while afterward, but never regains its earlier strength, drifting into the fragmented Third Intermediate Period, where rival dynasties once again split the country between north and south. Egypt's political fortunes keep shifting from here. A dynasty of Nubian kings from the Kingdom of Kush, sometimes called the Black Pharaohs, conquers a divided Egypt and rules the entire country as its 25th dynasty, presenting themselves as restorers of traditional Egyptian religion and culture, even as they add Nubian pyramid-building traditions of their own back home. But Kushite rule doesn't last either, ending when the expanding Assyrian Empire invades Egypt and drives the Nubian pharaohs back south. Egyptian independence briefly recovers under the native Said dynasty, sparking a genuine cultural revival that deliberately looks back to the glory days of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. But independence proves fragile. In 525 BC, the Persian Empire under Cambyses II conquers Egypt outright, folding it into the largest empire the world had yet seen. Egypt rebels against Persian rule more than once, briefly restoring native pharaohs, but Persia reconquers the country again in 343 BC, and Egyptian self-rule effectively ends for good. It doesn't stay under Persian control for long, though. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great sweeps through Egypt during his conquest of the Persian Empire, and the Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, largely welcome him as a liberator. Alexander founds a new city on the Mediterranean coast that will bear his name for the rest of history, Alexandria, though he never lives to see it grow into anything more than a construction site, dying just a few years later, far away in Babylon. After Alexander's death, his empire splinters among his generals, and one of them, Ptolemy, takes control of Egypt and founds an entirely new ruling dynasty, Greek in origin, but determined to rule as traditional pharaohs in Egyptian eyes. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria blossoms into one of the greatest intellectual centers in the ancient world, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria and the towering Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Greek and Egyptian culture blend together at the top of society, even as most ordinary Egyptians continue living much as their ancestors always had, farming the same fields along the same predictable river. The most famous member of this Greek dynasty is also its very last independent ruler, Cleopatra Sveva, fluent in Egyptian, unlike most of her predecessors, and a shrewd political operator. Cleopatra allies herself first with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony in a desperate attempt to keep Egypt independent as Rome's power grows increasingly impossible to ignore. It isn't enough. In 31 BC, Cleopatra and Antony's combined forces are decisively defeated by Octavian, soon to become the Emperor Augustus, at the Battle of Actium. The following year, with Alexandria surrounded and all hope gone, both Antony and Cleopatra take their own lives, and Egypt, after nearly 3,000 years of native and foreign pharaonic rule, becomes a province of the Roman Empire. Even under Roman and later Byzantine rule, Egyptian culture doesn't vanish overnight. Hieroglyphic writing and temple worship of the old gods linger for centuries longer, and the last known hieroglyphic inscription is carved as late as 394 AD at a temple on the island of Philae. But the knowledge of how to actually read that ancient script fades away for well over 1,000 years afterward, until French soldiers accompanying Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1799 stumble across a broken slab of stone near the town of Rosetta. That stone carries the same royal decree written out in 3 scripts: hieroglyphics, a simplified Egyptian script, and ancient Greek, and it's this side-by-side comparison that finally allows a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion to crack the code of hieroglyphic writing in 1822, reopening a 3,000-year conversation that had gone silent for almost as long as Egypt's civilization had originally lasted. So, ancient Egypt was never one unbroken golden age, and it definitely wasn't just pyramids and mummies. It was a civilization that rebuilt itself from collapse at least twice, absorbed foreign rulers and made them Egyptian in turn, briefly experimented with monotheism 1,000 years before the idea takes hold anywhere else, negotiated the world's oldest surviving peace treaty, and outlasted the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the Persian Empire that conquered it, only to finally lose its independence to Rome and quietly hand its writing system down to a French soldier's lucky discovery on a beach 2,000 years later. Very few civilizations in human history can claim a run anywhere close to that long, and fewer still leave monuments still standing under the same desert sun 3,000 years on.